Yeah, so Aquinas has this famous article in the Summa Theologiae where he gives 5 arguments for the existence of God, and this is often called the 5 ways. You know, in reality, Aquinas offers many arguments for the existence of God in his larger corpus. There's maybe 10 or 15 different arguments if you look through the different places that he makes arguments. But it's classical to go through the 5 ways and talk about what each one signifies, or the particular way of argumentation that's present there. And he frames them in a very succinct way, so you can't just read them and imagine that it's going to be absolutely clear. It presupposes often that you've done some Thomistic philosophy beforehand, but we can try to give a kind of brief, intuitive presentation of each one. So when Aquinas talks about the first way, what he's talking about really is an argument from change that occurs in material things. The word he uses in Latin, motio, is sometimes translated as movement, or well, it's true that he is thinking in part about what we call movement, but it's a broader category. So if you rightly understand it, change for Aquinas is the better category for understanding what he's talking about in physical things. So if we take any physical material reality, it's subject for Aquinas to at least 4 kinds of ontological change that it's undergoing in some respect all the time. The first would be qualitative change. So, for example, things are subject to changes in temperature, moving from hot to cold. They can change color. They can be subject to becoming musical after being non-musical. You take a child who's learning a musical instrument. That's a qualitative change. If you learn to play the piano, there's a change in the vitality of a plant as it grows to maturity and becomes capable of putting out fruits, seeds, and so forth. So there's all kinds of qualitative change happening in reality around us all the time. More obvious in living things, but also in some very straightforward ways, also in non-living things. The second form of change is quantitative. That's a clear example where a thing is changing shape or changing place. So something that's small becomes larger, something that's weighs less weighs more, or something that weighs more weighs less. And so things can change in quantity and dimensionality, and that's happening all the time. But the other kind of change, which is the most evident for us, is position. So we're always changing in our relationship to the sun and to the rest of the cosmos because of the movement of the earth, but also in relation to one another. The air is changing by coming through and moving against us and our bodies, and we're changing in our relationship to the light or the sun. And so there's changes of space and position. The fourth kind of physical change is the change of generation and corruption, wherein physical things come to be and cease to be through the motion or activity of others. Now, Aquinas is basically only trying to give as a premise to the first way that everything is subject to some kind of ontological physical change because of the activity of another. And he calls this the change of movement from potency to act. That we're all, for example, in potentiality becoming hotter or colder, but the relationship we have with the sun or with the heat that's local to our building or our particular place on the earth is going to affect whether we're potentially more hot or more cold, or we're in potentiality to be in this room or this city or that city, or to be in this relationship to Jupiter or that relationship to Jupiter, and we're in potentiality to be way more or way less, to be greater, to be lesser, in potentiality to develop this quality or that quality. And more radically, we are in potentiality to be generated or to be corrupted as physical beings because of our actual dependency on others. Okay, from this it emerges that every physical thing is, as it were, dependent on other physical things. And here we could think in a kind of metaphorical way about a vast web or a network in which nothing is autonomous, everything is dependent, and everything is being changed in actuality by everything else. Well, through, you might say, series of causes. When you think about series of causes, you don't have to think very rigorously about one train car pulling another train car, pulling another train car. That's a helpful illustration, but the point is that there are distinct things in the world that are physical, and they're all impacting one another through vast chains or networks, or series of causal dependency. Okay, so then we can ask the question, is that all there is? Are there just physical, natural things that are causing each other to change, that are acting on one another? And Aquinas says, well, there simply can't be only those kinds of causes. Because in an actual series of interdependent causes, you can't only have an actual series of dependent causes in which everything is always dependent on something else, but nothing is ever first. Now, this is important. He's not saying this argument applies chronologically. A lot of people think Aquinas is arguing here that there had to be a first something before the Big Bang, if we go back in time, or something that was uncaused that kicked everything off and gave all the physical temporal causes their initial impact or motion or start. He thinks we don't have access to the Big Bang or to what happened before the beginning of the world temporally. So we can't prove there was an initial first event or something before the first event from a uniquely philosophical or even scientific point of view. You might say from a scientific point of view, yeah, okay, there was a Big Bang, it looks like, but there could have been something before that, a first collapse that gave rise to it, and before that something, before the collapse, another Big Bang, or who knows? We weren't there. Maybe science can show it's very probable that there was only the Big Bang and nothing before it, but it can't demonstrate philosophically that there was nothing before it, and we weren't there to see it. So Aquinas is actually surprisingly agnostic on that question. He thinks that the argument takes its root in the things that exist now. Right now in the world, actualistically, at any given moment, we consider the question, physical things are interdependent. They all really exist. They don't explain themselves without reference to another. So there's, you might say a huge and vast chain, actually we know it's magnificently vast chain of interdependent physical things. But you can't just have that kind of reality, because nowhere on that chain that you go in the web of interdependent things can you find something that purely explains itself or gives a sufficient reason, as it were, proportionate reason or explanation for its own existence without reference to another. And you can't just always be referring to another physical thing that's itself dependent and another thing that's dependent. You have to have something that's transcendent of all the series of ordered interdependent causes that is itself immaterial, not subject to material dependency and change, not subject to quantitative growth or diminishment, not subject to qualitative diminishment or development, but which is, as Aquinas says, purely actual or actualistic in its perfection, so that it's not dependent, but you might say independent, and that is giving being to all the physical, natural, dependent realities. So if there is a world of ordered, intelligible, dependent, physical, natural realities that are actuating each other, causing each other to be, this can only be because there's some transcendent, independent, immaterial, purely actual author of the physical world, and that is the Creator, who we call God.